Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, it is a great pleasure to speak to you today. As you all know, the global community is on a mission to accelerate the energy revolution and decarbonize the transport and industries. It is a mission that transcends geographic borders and industrial sectors, and Ecosperity's belief that doing good and doing well can and must go together provides a succinct reminder to all of us with the responsibility for implementing those dreams. My own focus is on the maritime industry, which drives the global economy. So, we must work with all stakeholders to find solutions to ensure that the resilience of the supply chain is protected even as the pandemic and the current military crisis continue to impact not only shipping and the ports, but also seafarers and all maritime personnel. As we navigate our way through what has already been a turbulent decade, it is clear that shipping is voyaging through an immense transition to meet demand for sustainable transport through digitalization, automation, ship design, propulsion technology, and the fuels. We at the International Maritime Organization, as the International Shipping Global Standard Setting Authority for Safety, Security, and Environmental Performance, are constantly enhancing our regulatory framework. Our goal is to ensure shipping continues to operate safely, securely, cleanly, and efficiently, and our commitment is to significantly reduce greenhouse gas (GHG) emissions from international shipping and ultimately decarbonize shipping. To decarbonize a truly global industry, global solutions are needed. IMO regulations are not just commitments, they are legally binding requirements applicable worldwide. IMO adopted the first mandatory global measures to improve ships' energy efficiency more than a decade ago in 2011. These have since been strengthened, recognizing the imperative to do more. IMO's initial Ghg strategy was adopted in 2018 with a clear vision to phase out GHG emissions from international shipping as soon as possible this century, and by at least 50% by 2050 compared to 2008. Only last year, IMO adopted a list of comprehensive midterm GHG measures to achieve these ambitious goals, which take effect from November 2022. Now it is time to accelerate our actions to set the path for shipping's decarbonization in line with the objectives of the 2015 Paris Agreement and the Glasgow Climate Pact adopted at COP26 and the most recent IPCC climate reports. The upgraded IMO greenhouse gas strategy is set to be adopted mid-2023. The key element of the strategy is an enhanced level of ambition in line with global agreement to accelerate the reduction of GHG emissions from international shipping toward its decarbonization by the middle of this century. To make this possible, IMO member states have already initiated discussion to set a maximum carbon content for marine fuels and the carbon pricing mechanism to incentivize R&D of low and zero carbon fuels and the move to these new fuels. We must all consider the impact of a new measure on developing countries, in particular small island developing states and the least developed countries, to make sure no one is left behind. For a just and equitable transition, IMO continues to expand existing initiatives and capacity building projects and enhance cooperation with the financial institutions to remove barriers that may impede investment in the shipping's energy transition. The revised Ghg strategy will set the path for the way ahead, and I have every confidence that progress will continue to be made at the global level. The importance of a global supply chain has become even more apparent. The enhancement of digitalization and automation to facilitate global maritime trade is a major policy issue that shipping must take on board in 2022 and beyond. IMO is working to enable shipping to embrace the digital revolution while ensuring safety, boosting environmental protection, and managing cybersecurity risks to facilitate trade and sustainable maritime transport. To summarize, major changes and challenges lie ahead for the maritime sector. These have considerable repercussions for the maritime workforce, in particular seafarers, which need to be ready for this evolution. It is imperative that education, training, skills evolve, and IMO continues to engage with the member state and industry toward that end. We must rise to this challenge and create a workforce to operate the green ships of the future safely and securely. Ladies and gentlemen, you have set yourself ambitious targets for this Ecosperity Week as you look at accelerating the energy transition and decarbonizing transport and heavy industry. I look forward to hearing of the innovations and the solutions that will emerge from your discussions. Shipping is essential to the world and must be at the forefront of the change as we strive for a more sustainable and greener maritime future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lim, for setting the foundation for a conversation, of course, emphasizing the need for a resilient and also a responsible supply chain across the maritime sector. And those of you who were with us yesterday, we were looking at hydrogen and using that energy and seeing how shipping in Asia is looking towards that. So Korea is building ammonia ships, which is an essential component when we look at hydrogen as a type of clean, renewable energy. I think Japan is following suit. And we're having this conversation right here in Singapore, which is, of course, a very important bunker hub. So let's get the show on the road. I know our panelists have been waiting very, very patiently, and we're looking forward to this conversation. Please welcome to the stage, we have Miss Joanna Christensen, the CEO of Global Maritime Forum, who has come in from Copenhagen. We're very grateful. Thank you. Joining her on stage is Professor Lynn Liu, who is the CEO for Global Center for Maritime Decarbonization. Thank you very much. Looking forward to this chat. We have Jeremy Nixon with us, the CEO of Ocean Network Express. Much obliged. And Quah Hoon is the Chief Executive at Maritime and Port Authority of Singapore, who I think has just come in from Greece as well. So really, a global panel here in a global discussion. Joanna, over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for the kind introduction. So what you have is not only an international panel, but also a slightly jet-lagged one. I hope you can forgive us for that. So, well, welcome to the session on making waves in sustainable shipping. As you heard from Secretary General Kitack Lim, for shipping to decarbonize by 2050, zero-emission fuels and vessels need to be deployed at scale, even within this decade. And there's much to be done, even in the next few years, to achieve that objective. And perhaps I can offer a bit of context about shipping decarbonization. And there are many parallels. You'll recognize some of this context from some of the previous panels on aviation and the one that we just heard before about vehicle decarbonization, in that there are sort of similarities in sort of the uptake of solutions. A first thing to raise is decarbonizing international shipping is not going to be easy. There's a good reason why it's called a hard-to-abate sector. First, it can't readily be electrified, especially not the 80,000 plus vessels that trade on the deep seas. And they use in the vicinity of 300 million tons of fuel oil annually. So it's quite a significant energy need that needs to be met for international shipping. Second, it's a really diverse and disaggregated sector, unlike, for example, the power sector, even to some degree, the aviation sector. It operates with many different cargoes, many different operating and business models around the world, trading globally. And then outside of the container sector, which we've represented here today, it's highly fragmented with many, many small operators with just tiny fleets. So that adds to the challenge. Most importantly, though, is that we have neither zero-emission vessels nor scalable zero-emission fuels available today, which means that in order to start the transition to zero-emission shipping, we have to overcome this chicken and egg dilemma that we've heard about in previous discussions over these past day and a half or so, whereby investors in vessels are waiting for the fuels to become available, and the investors in the fuels are waiting for the vessels to become available. So with that, I will turn to Lynn first. She's our only doctor. Unlike the aviation panel, we only have one, I'm sorry. But Lynn is it. So the maritime sector has been exploring a range of potential zero-carbon solutions, such as hydrogen and ammonia that have already been mentioned, but they're still produced only in tiny quantities and are not really available on a commercial basis. And even if many pilots are underway and MOUs are being signed and the like, so there's a lot of movement happening, but we don't have a clear line of sight on when, it gives a lot of uncertainty, let's put it that way, for the sector's decarbonization. So at the Global Center for Maritime Decarbonization, you're looking at sort of the technological and commercial hurdles that need to be overcome in order to make zero-emission solutions widely available. Could you tell us a little bit, what have you found so far? What are some of the uncertainties that you see?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for that question, Johanna. Maybe I'll start by stepping back and talk about the complexity of the energy system. I think the system is complex because of several reasons. One is the timeline. The energy infrastructure as we know it took more than a century to build, and here we are trying to transition to a completely different energy infrastructure in less than 30 years. So the timeline is substantially compressed. The other would be the number of players along this fuel supply chain. There are more players now, it's more complex than the traditional fossil fuel supply chain, where you have the fossil fuel companies that are extracting, that are refining, and then they are supplying. So here we have the renewable energy company, we have the hydrogen producers, we have the electrolyzer manufacturers, we have the ammonia producers, and if you're talking about green methanol, you need people who are experts and who can actually capture biogenic carbon and do direct air capture. So it's very complex. And then the interdependencies between these players become important. Without enough capacity of renewable electrons, you don't get enough green hydrogen. If you don't get enough green hydrogen, that in itself has many end uses, you don't have green marine fuel. So that's why this whole system is so complex. And just to come back to, I think, in the aviation panel, Lauren had mentioned, there's a lot of will and ambition, and that's completely true. But I think we need more than will and ambition to get to the net zero goals. We need faster permitting, we need proper regulations, we need proper financing, and then we really need time to build these infrastructure in place, right? And so just to give you some examples, I mean, if we just look at hydrogen, this was numbers I looked up 6 months ago, granted. 6 months ago, if you look across the announcements, there are about 250 gigawatts of green hydrogen in the pipeline, right? So this is just announcement on projects in pipeline, so ambition. If you look across the world, there are 200 megawatts, so 3 orders of magnitude lower in terms of electrolyzers are producing hydrogen, but this is gray because it's not using renewable electrons. And then if you really look at green hydrogens, it's 20 megawatts, right? So it's another order of magnitude lower. So this comes back to the scale that you were talking about earlier. But that's no reason for being despondent. I would say that there are lots of things we can do in parallel simultaneously to help accelerate the production, the scaling, and eventual deployment of these green fuels. So at GCMD, one of the things we're doing is to identify gaps along this supply chain. And by identifying these gaps, we want to plug in these gaps. So in this specific example is this ammonia bunkering study that we've commissioned back in January. We're looking at the safety of bunkering ammonia, figuring that this is a no-regret move. If we can iron out the safety guidelines, iron out the operation guidelines in the meantime, before ammonia becomes at scale, then by the time ammonia becomes at scale, we're ready to go. So that's sort of, I think, what we need to do. We need to move in parallel, work on all these puzzle pieces in parallel so that we can proceed faster.
Yeah. Thank you for offering some insight on some of the timescales that involve. I can give some encouraging words on top of that, which is there was a panel yesterday that looked at that pipeline of green hydrogen projects, and there's been a significant increase even since 6 months ago. So that's at least encouraging, but certainly not at the other end
Right.
of that timeline of what's actually available today. So that obviously takes time to move through the pipeline. Jeremy, sort of in the face of this sort of uncertainty and navigating this period of uncertainty around the zero emission fuels and whatnot, I guess it will be pretty key for new vessels to be future proof. And that's no less the case in a context where you're operating under capacity constraints and you're looking to add new capacity to your fleet. As a CEO of one of the world's largest container shipping lines, how do you see the industry actually navigating that uncertainty and managing transition risks in your fleet?
Thank you, Joanna. Yeah, I think very much both of you have very well outlined the challenges we have ahead, and we have to be optimistic, we have to collaborate to get to the new technologies and the new fuel types, which hopefully are going to kick in sometime towards 228, 229, 230. I'm a little bit optimistic, so I'm on that level. Some people say, Jeremy, it's going to be after 230, but let's just assume the new kit and the new fuels will start to come on board. So the container ship, well, the shipping industry today is all types of different ships. It's 60,000 different ships out there, 60,000 ships burning about 250 million tons of fuel oil. That's about 750 million tons of CO2, right? So that's the problem statement we have as an industry today. Hard to abate, 3% of global CO2. So the shipyard capacity, our ability to retool or rebuild new ships, realistically is about 3,000 to 4,000 new ships a year. So we can only start replacing 5% of the fleet each year. So over the next 20 years, we are still going to have existing ships out there on the water. So we have two ways of thinking. One is to make sure we build the new stuff in the future, which is the right technology and the right new types of green fuels. But secondly, what can we do now to try to reduce the carbon intensity of the current ships we have? And Mr. Kitack Lim, who is the good Lord when it comes to shipping, he is the IMO, the UN overlord, and the regulator for our industry. He's set us two key objectives. One is by 2050 to significantly reduce our carbon footprint. Actually, many of us are saying we should be more ambitious than that, should take it to net zero by 2050. But the other one is, he says, by 2030, please reduce your carbon intensity by 40% by 2030 compared with 2008. So that's our immediate short-term goal. And I think the industry is well on track to do that. In fact, I feel really, really confident from my own company's perspective. We're looking at maybe a 70% reduction by 2030. And how are we going to do that? So we're already, over the last 10 years, we've been building bigger ships, more fuel-efficient ships. So very similar to the aviation industry that we talked about just now, where you put a new asset out there, it's going to be 10, 15, 20% more efficient than the old stuff it's replacing. So of course, we've been doing that. Secondly, we're starting to look at new builds which could be retroactively fitted in the future for the new fuel types or engine types. So my own company is now ordering ships which will come out of the shipyards in 224, 225, still burning carbon fuel, but by 228, 229, 230 can go back into the yard, be retrofitted for carbon capture, maybe for ammonia, maybe for green methanol. So we're building something that will not be a stranded asset for 25 years. Maybe 5 years on old technology, 20 years on new technology. And I think that's one way to go. But there's many other ships out there which we need to reduce the carbon intensity on. So we're looking at things like, of course, biofuel, but we burn 250 million tons of fuel. So we can't go and all switch over to biofuel like the aviation possibly could do with the SFA concept. So we've got to look at other ideas as well. We've got to make the ships, existing ships, more fuel efficient, reduce the friction through the water. So we're looking at retrofitting new bows, new propellers, new paint systems, scrubbing those hulls so they minimize the drag in the water. We're looking at new ways of going back in and looking at some of the engineering and boiler systems and making those more efficient. We're looking at wind devices. We're looking at solar devices that could also help with that as well. So all of these components can help to reduce down our carbon intensity. And of course, that makes sense because it also reduces fuel, it reduces our cost. But in all of this equation going forward, what we have to think about is shipping carries 90% of global trade. We are the world's scope 3. You reduce carbon intensity of shipping, decarbonize shipping, you decarbonize the world. So we also have to make sure that we work with the regulators here to make sure that we come up with a practical way of decarbonizing, but also in terms of how we handle that and how we pass on the cost. But maybe that's going to be subject to a later discussion.
I hope so. I hope so. And while you're speaking about the international regulator, as you've already spelled out, the IMO has committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions from international shipping by at least 50% by 2050, a goal that to date still falls short of the Paris Agreement goals. So we're hoping that ambition will be raised, and I think Secretary General Kitack already spoke to that. But of course, as the UN body works towards ramping up its ambition and putting in place the frameworks that we need to actually make that transition possible, port authorities, such as the Maritime and Port Authority of Singapore, play a really key role in the interim, right? In terms of partnering with industry to catalyze the transition and providing incentives and whatnot. Earlier this year, Hoon, you published or you and your colleagues at the MPA published a blueprint for Maritime Singapore's decarbonization, and it includes a bunch of different measures that are to incentivize this energy transition for shipping. Could you talk a little bit about what they are and what role you think, and will they be enough?
Well, I'll just build on what Lynn and Jeremy had said. For Maritime Singapore Decarb Blueprint, there are actually two aspects. One is on the domestic front, and one is on the international front. On the domestic front, we are very clear. We have to strive towards net zero. So PSA, for example, and Jurong Port, our port terminals have aimed towards a net zero position by 2050. And they've been putting in place a lot of trials and pilots, including hydrogen fuel cell prime movers to try to make our port efficient. Similarly, on the domestic harbour craft side, we are also looking at first transition to biofuel, then electrifying it. And we are actually working with a lot of industry players to try to incentivize the mass upscaling of such infrastructure. Today, I think we talk a little bit more on the international front. On the international front, as what Lynn and Jeremy has alluded, it is a bit more complex. In fact, I would say that for maritime, it's more complex than aviation because our sector is pretty much more heterogeneous.
Yeah.
And there are also different many touch points in terms of shipyards, in terms of standards, in terms of equipment, in terms of class society. We have a lot more players around. Therefore, from a port regulator perspective of Singapore, because we are a hub port and we are International Maritime Center, and we think that we can play a part to nudge the process forward. And I would say that there's three key areas we are looking into. The first is really technology, and as we have all alluded, including previous panels, we need to achieve the S-curve for technology mass adoption. We need to make the new technology cheaper and easier to adopt in a mass scale. On this front, in terms of some of the financing that we have sort of put in, and I would say the industry from the maritime actually has been very proactive in it. When we came up with the idea of a global center for maritime decarbonization, we put in 60 mil from MPA, and we got private sector players to come in with 60 mil. And after the setup of the GCMD, which actually all of us are involved in it, in the way we are on the board, we've got another 8 more players coming on board, increasing it from 120 mil to 155 mil. So the will and the commitment from the industry is there. Now, second, from where Singapore is coming from is, as a hub port and the largest bunkering hub in the world, we need to ensure that the standards and the regulations are in place. And that's where we commit to actually go for a multi-fuel bunkering hub. What does that mean? We won't have one solution. In the transition, we will have biofuel. In fact, we are ready for LNG, we are ready for low sulfur, high sulfur. We are ready for biofuel. We have already done 10 pilot trials. we need to go into methanol, ethanol, methanol, hydrogen. That makes multi-fuel, 8-fuel to be ready for port and land infrastructure. And that requires not just working with the shipping companies, but also with our energy companies, class society, standards. So it requires a whole value chain ecosystem effort. And that's where we're moving towards from Singapore in terms of the Maritime Decarb Blueprint, help to sort of nudge pilots and trials, provide incentives to move forward, ensure that standards are ready. We can set up regulatory sandbox to do the bunkering here. At any one time in Singapore port, we have 1,000 ships. Can you imagine if all the 1,000 ships are ammonia fuel? And the level of toxicity, the level of sensitive handling is important. And that's where we can help to set up a regular sandbox, come up, take in studies and findings from the various studies, make sure that it is safe, and when we can set such regulatory standards and share with other port authorities, you will have a network. And that's one of the conversations we had when I was in Dubai and Abu Dhabi with a few of our port authorities together.
Oh, that's good to hear. And in that sense, you're actually paving the way for others to follow your example. And I'm glad to see that that's finding its way out into the world.
I would say it's a collaboration. It has to be all set together and all must have that same understanding on moving forward. Yeah.
Fair enough. Singapore also joined the Clydebank Declaration on Green Shipping Corridors earlier this year. What role do you see for Singapore in this regard? You know, what do you expect to come out of that?
You know, I started with Ministry of Trade Industry, so in a way, when you see climate change, it is actually at 3 levels. My minister mentioned that at the IMO level, it needs to set level playing field to all players. At the same time, it is actually possible for us to do into regional collaborations and bilateral collaborations. So the idea of the Clydebank is really to set up maritime corridor, and GMF is also advocating for it. What we are doing is actually looking at like-minded port authorities to form green and efficient corridors, working together with GCMD as well as our industry partners and companies. How do we form that corridor? And actually, we can actually put digital and clean together. Because in a way, when you are efficient, you are digitalized, you are also, in a way, energy efficient. So I think if we couple digital and green corridors together, it can be quite a powerful concept, and that's something which we are working with some other port authorities. Hopefully, we can see some results in the next few months.
That sounds great. I think we'll come back to that digital piece as well later on in the panel. Lynn, I think one thing that's underappreciated is just the cost of this transition, and you've also already alluded to it in part. But there's an estimated 2.4 trillion in cumulative investment that will be needed to decarbonize shipping by 2050, and the bulk of this is going to be on land. So you discussed some of the technological hurdles earlier. You discussed some of the rollout hurdles and timelines involved in scaling some of these fuels. But there have to be reasons to be optimistic as well.
Yeah.
In particular, given the funding the pot of funding that GCMD nonetheless sits on and can play a really key role in catalyzing some of that investment, I hope, and de-risking. Can you talk a little bit about what role you see GCMD playing in that regard?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So, I mean, the way we see the energy transition is that, you know, solutions are going to have to come in 3 buckets, and Jeremy alluded to this as well. We need to think about near-term solutions, we need to think about mid-term solutions, and then we need to think about long-term solutions. So the zero-carbon fuels are the long-term solution bucket. We need to work on those to kind of accelerate production, scale, and deployment. But in the meantime, we need to start bending the curve now if we're serious about hitting the 2050 net zero target. And so, in that respect, I'll just mention 2 examples. We're getting ready to roll out a big pilot involving 13 vessels across 3 ports. This is the idea of providing transparency and traceability across the supply chain for drop-in fuels. So let me just back up. When we think about these green fuels, none of them are really available at scale. And so in order for you to start decarbonizing, you're going to blend the green fuels with the gray fuels. And so these green fuels command a green premium. And in speaking with the stakeholders across the board, we realize that the pain point is really in the supply chain. How do you ensure that you have quality, quantity, and abatement potential assurance over that supply chain? And so this pilot, the goal of this pilot is really to provide that transparency across that supply chain. It's to aggregate demand at the port site. It's to build up the supply chain and the infrastructure on the port side. And so we're beginning to go beyond single individual pilots that Lei Hoon had talked about to think about route-based pilots involving port pairs. And so this is our way from the bottom up, building towards and being able to support these G2G concept of green corridors. Right? So this is a big pilot that we will be rolling out soon. And in another example is carbon capture. We think shipboard carbon capture has to be part of the solution. It provides the runway for green fuels to scale. And so what this means is you need the system that's on board to be able to capture carbon. And as Jeremy said, for every ton of fuel you burn, you generate 3 tons of carbon dioxide. And so if you absorb all this carbon dioxide, where are you going to put it, right? And so on the ship, you're always worried about volume because you're competing with cargo space. So these are some of the technical challenges that we need to think through. And then the captured carbon dioxide, it's really not a cargo, it's a waste. So how do you debunker that carbon dioxide, and what do you eventually use it for? So we're taking a very holistic life cycle assessment, well-to-wake approach in thinking about these different technologies and solutions. We're using our war chest of funds to pilot some of these solutions in hopes that with these pilotings, there are going to be learnings, and we're going to lower the barrier for the eventual market adoption.
Well, that's fingers crossed that all of these things, because and this is really the key point that you're also making, is that we're going to need to put everything into play.
Yeah.
Not any one solution is going to be a panacea. We're going to have to put everything into play. And I think that also goes for some of the technological solutions as systems transformations that you're really alluding to, right? Can you talk a little bit more about what some of those examples are? I think there's a, there's a case maybe outside of container shipping for slow steaming, but there is also to save on fuel, but there is also the sort of system perspective of ensuring most efficient route planning, arrival planning, and the likes. Maybe that's something you can speak to.
So maybe on 2 areas. For the Port of Singapore, I mean, during this global supply chain disruption, right, I mean, PSA is trying its best to be a catch-up port. And actually what's important for both resilience and green is that we can digitalize as much as possible the efficiency of the route. First of all, can we use more electronic transactions, for example, whether it's EBL, e-bills of lading, e-bunkery delivery note. Then secondly, for Port of Singapore, we have actually put in place the digital port SG, which means to say that it's a one-stop clearance in terms of port clearance for ships coming to the port. Our next phase is to do just-in-time. And indeed, one of the questions that came from the public is really the just-in-time is important because then the ships, when they arrive in the port, they will know that the marine services are actually lined up for them. You don't have to stay too long, and you can time your schedule more efficiently. And knowing what some of the cargo solutions out there, and I'm sure Jeremy is also working on it, is really looking at also door-to-door, right? I was told that between a factory to a home in delivery, you have at least 18 touch points in the supply chain, and that's how complex the supply chain is. How do you digitalize this entire chain? Not just shipping, cargo owners, shippers, how do you put all of them together, and that, bear in mind, they are both MNCs and SMEs. How do you bring them on board on this digitalization journey so that not only we have a greener supply chain, greener shipping, we also have a more efficient supply chain. So that's the few areas that we are working on just in time, digitalizing the transaction so that we no longer rely on manual. With port authorities, we are also trying to do API in terms of our systems and database to see whether we can sort of remove the need for manual clearance. And all this will help to make shipping more efficient.
That sounds great. And I hope we're going to hear a little more about it. There's a panel, I think it's after this one, that's going to be going a little bit more into depth about some of those supply chain solutions that will also help us on our decarbonization journey. Before we get there, though, I do have a question for you, Jeremy, because Lynn already touched on this issue of demand and how important demand will be, both on the, actually all the way through the value chain, right? So the demand from your customers, the demand from you for the fuel and whatnot, like that's going to be passed through the entire supply chain in order to catalyze the investment into the projects. On a panel yesterday, Alicia Eastman of Intercontinental Energy pointed to shipping as a possible first off-taker of green fuels, such as hydrogen and ammonia. And as we wait for, and as we're hoping for the IMO to move quickly to put in place global regulations, what steps do you think that industry can take in the interim to push forward with the green transition and to move ahead, even in this period of also regulatory uncertainty, not only fuel uncertainty?
Yeah, thanks, Joanna. And I think one of the sort of common viewpoints across the industry now is that decarbonisation should not be a point of competition. Actually, we need to all work together, we need to collaborate together, we need to decarbonise the world together. And shipping needs to work together as an industry to do that, and the sooner we can do that, the better everybody's going to be. And of course, our customers, so in the container shipping industry, which I'm part of, we have 30,000 customers as my company, but we've probably got 400,000 direct customers out there, B2B business. They're all starting to push now and saying, you're my scope 3, what are you doing about reducing? So we compete heavily with each other in the container sector, but we do have a trade association called the World Shipping Council, and we are looking together as the industry, and also this is very relevant to also Joanna's area in the Global Maritime Forum, where these trade associations are coming together and saying, let's try to work on a common pathway, a common way to drive this forward, and work with the regulators to try to help and push them to go quicker, but also make sure the solutions that come forward are really realistic and practical. Because at the end of the day, if we make these impractical, they're not going to work in the ports, but secondly, the costs are going to be so ridiculous that our customers at the end of the day can't absorb these costs and pass them on through the supply chain. So the World Shipping Council, we put forward a 6-part transition plan, 6 key pillars. We do want a carbon price. We want it to be fair, reliable, predictable, universal for everybody, so we have a market-based measure. We do want to come back to particularly Lynn's point, which is we need to have measurability around the carbon intensity. We can make all sorts of claims about how green we are. We can take all sorts of fuels on board and say we're doing the right thing, but are we? It needs to be fully transparency and accountable. So we want to see a common accounting visual system where we can see what is the carbon intensity of the fuels that we're using, not just from where we take them on and bunker them through to where we burn them, but as Lynn says, all the way through from the well through to the wake of the ship. We need to come up with common standard designs on ships, universal, so the shipyards can work to one universal standard and phase out certain types of production at certain times. We need to work with the port authorities and everybody in the supply chain. We don't want 7 or 8 fuels. We need to get down probably to 2 types of fuel by 2030. That's going to make it better for the power companies, shipping companies, the port authorities. So real collaboration. And that's why we want to see such strong initiatives from the Global Maritime Decarbonisation Centre and other collaboration centres, industry working together to move as fast as we can and work with our industry regulator to make that possible and quicker.
Well, I'm certainly supportive of all 6 of those points. So that's, I think, as are Hoon and Lynn as well. That's really good to hear. I think before we round up, we just have a few more minutes. I think it'd be great to hear from each of you. What if you had this magic wand? And I think the aviation panel had that sort of last question as well. What's the one thing that you would like to see happen? And particularly, what are the sorts of no regret moves? You've already mentioned one at the top of the panel, Lynn. What are others that you see?
Oh, we're starting.
I'm going to start with you.
Okay, so if I had a magic wand, I'm just thinking back to why I joined the industry, and I was told, this was because I was brand new to shipping. I was told shipping's a global industry. There's one regulator. There's a global industry. It would be really nice to have a global carbon policy, because I think with a policy like this, from a technology and a solutions perspective, it levels the playing field. So your fossil fuel's not at a discount. It levels the playing field for solutions and technologies. I think just going forward, I think it provides certainty for investors, for ship owners, so that they can have confidence and they can have certainty in what they're investing in their future assets. So it would be really, really nice if there is a carbon policy.
Yep. Jeremy?
Yeah, I think fundamentally to decarbonize, really properly decarbonize, and take the carbon atom out of the whole supply chain, fundamentally we need to get to green hydrogen. Green hydrogen, for the reasons explained, is quite challenging actually to operate ships on pure green hydrogen, because we have to carry it at minus 275 degrees, and it takes up 5 times more space, and actually it's pretty dangerous stuff. So probably ammonia, which of course has some dangers, is probably one of the potentials. But ultimately, whether we go with any of these green fuels, green hydrogen is going to be the core requirement. And same as the aviation industry, we need masses and masses of green hydrogen in the future to help us decarbonize. Get us the green hydrogen, we can go from there with absolute certainty.
For me, three things. First is really we need availability of energy, like what Jeremy mentioned. So really the energy companies and the shipping companies need to work very closely together so that it's not a chicken and egg problem. Second, financing. I think that's where we need to look at how do we push green financing in a bigger wave so that we can allow not just the big players, but also your SMEs to be able to move along. And lastly, action. Action and action. And if I could piece the various panels together in the previous section, one magic solution, if we could all achieve it, is actually to achieve a circular carbon economy. If that can be achievable, then actually it solves the problem for all sectors. So hopefully a circular carbon future, a solution that can come out on how we can transport liquid carbon dioxide, it can be used to produce something which is able to be for sales, and therefore you can make some profits out of it, and from that profit you can regenerate into technology advancement. So circular future, circular carbon economy, if we could come up with one.
So in the world where there's infinite amount of electrons, renewable electrons, that's certainly possible. Yeah. So we need to work on upstream.
Okay, so that's, in short, policy. Policy certainty, I guess, is the key point. Massive amounts of green electrons in one form and another for the sector, and action, action, action is what I heard as the sort of the magic wand types of activities that we'd want to see in the short term. Well, with that, thank you very much. I don't think we have any more questions from the audience, so thank you. And I hope we, well, to use a metaphor that others have used already, all hands on deck, we can make it happen.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.